But just on the oxalate thing very quickly with almonds, because this is important. The oxalates come through in almonds, it comes through in almond flour, it comes through in almond butter, and it comes through in almond milk. And one of the issues right now with kids, and we're seeing more kids ever presenting with kidney stones that are growing up in vegan households where they're drinking massive amounts of almond milk. Instead of cow's milk, they're drinking almond milk, and it's overloading their organs. So it comes through in all that. If you like that almond flavor, which I do,
yes,
it doesn't come through in almond extract. So almond extract doesn't have the oxalate. Extracts and oils don't have there's a lot of reasons not to have nut or seed oils, but oxalates are not one of them. They don't come through in the oils, they don't come through in the extracts. As far as nut butters are concerned, like I mentioned, nut and seed butters, almond butter is off the charts high in oxalates. So it's anything made from sesame, so tahini is off the charts high.
So when you were talking, I was thinking, okay, so what is the best way to eat spinach? What is the best way to eat it? Because they are lovely. Like when you have a lovely salad, like it's a lovely thing to have. But you've kind of answered the question. So you say the safest way to consume plants is seasonally and local, because then you get exposed to these oxalates and these kind of toxins for a short period of time, which you can imagine our ancestors did as well. And then they're gone, like for the rest of the year. And that's the safest way to consume them. So that brings us back to being what it means to be human, like to just eat the food that's available, that's around you, and to not rely so much on the supermarket, and to go more to like, you know, farmers markets and foraging as you speak of. So that's the safest way to have it. And also you mentioned fruit. That was a question of mine, because I was like, you know, does fruit come into that? But it doesn't, because the fruit is designed to have to release its seed and to have the seed go on. So when we eat fruit, we don't eat the seed and expect that to be the nutrition. We eat the fruit. So that explains why fruit is better to eat, but obviously seasonally and local is obviously, you know, in line with this conversation, the best thing to do. So I mean, this kind of ties into this question. So I'm a functional medicine student, and so the functional medicine kind of space, they would say that, okay, so there are toxins in plants, but it's a good stress. They would say it's like a hormetic stress. I'm sure you've come across that before. They're like, yeah, vegetables are fine. It's a hormetic stress. It's good. So what would you say to that? I think you've kind of covered it in a way. So you might not need to say much about it, but what would you say to those people who say it's hormesis, like it's good, it's a good stress?
My answer to that is to a point. Yeah, absolutely, to a point. So again, if you are eating, and the answers are literally right in front of us. We want to sit in our living room on our computers and have somebody else tell us these things. It's almost like, and I've sat in, you know, family and I have been on the couch and we're doing some work or whatever, and somebody says, hey, you know, what's the temperature outside? And we Google the weather instead of walking out the door. It's the same kind of thing. We want to sit there and have somebody tell us how to eat. And the reality is we can do it ourselves. So eating locally as much as possible, eating seasonally. And when I say like locally, I mean like hyper locally. And that doesn't just include like the plants and the fruits and the animals that you get at the grocery store, the farmers market. It's also the bacteria and the yeast that are on your countertops and on your skin and in the air, things like sourdough, all of that, right? So that number one is eating. You could solve. I'll give you a quick example, and you actually, maybe this is somebody that would be a fantastic guest for you. Cian Foley is from Ireland. He wrote a book called "Don't Eat for Winter." And the quick version, the very good version, and I just want to drive home a point here. When he was in his late 30s, he was overweight. I didn't know him then, but I think fairly overweight. And I think he tried a bunch of different weight loss things. And he's sitting. He lives near Waterford in Ireland, and he said that, you know, he was in his kitchen looking out the window. It was the middle of December, so it was cold out, and he was eating an apple. And he was looking out, and out his window was actually an apple tree. And he's looking at the apple tree. He's eating this apple in December, and not only did the tree have no apples on it, it didn't have any leaves on it. He's like, "What am I like? I don't understand. What am I doing?" And he realized that if you look at the plants that are available and what nutrition or nutrients they can provide at the end of the summer and into the fall, they're all very high carbohydrate. You know, that's when most of your fruits are ripe. That's when a lot of your potato, your starches are. And his thinking at the time, okay, animals eat for winter, and they eat these very starch rich foods, carbohydrate rich foods, putting on a layer of fat, getting rid of, getting ready for the winter when the food supply changes, and they go into the winter heavy. They lose that weight throughout the winter, and then they go into the spring. And he said, you know what? The only thing I'm going to do is eat hyper seasonally. Like, I'm only going to eat the food that's in season, not in season because it's in a greenhouse and a hoop house and a strip. No, literally what's in season. I'm going to eat that food, and that's it. And he has since become a world amateur bodybuilding medalist. He's a kettlebell champion. I mean, the guy's the epitome of health. And the only thing that he did was eat seasonally, and that's it. And he even says, look, when the winter, when towards the end of the summer, going into the winter, my fat, I put on fat,
Yeah.
and then it goes down over the winter, and it was brilliant. So eating seasonally and locally. Now, I will say there's a lot of pleasure. One of the things we as humans do is derive amazing pleasure and build so many different things around food, not just the food itself, but the way we consume the food. Holidays are based on food in many ways. Traditions are based on food. So we eat very locally, but I love certain spices I get from other parts of the world. I mean, I love other things. So we do bring those things in, but the base of your diet, if it is seasonal and it is local, that's fantastic. In addition to that, by doing that, you're connecting directly with the people, or at least one step away from the people that are growing that food. And that tight-knit part is great. The other thing that I think is incredibly important is cooking from scratch, learning how to cook from scratch. Even if you don't do it all the time, doing that recalibrates the way you look at that food, right? And then just as importantly, if not most importantly, whatever direct connection you can get to that food, do it. And it doesn't have to be every day. We're all busy. We all have jobs and careers and hobbies and friends and kids and whatever else is pulling us in different directions. But those moments in my life where I can go foraging, or I can go hunting, or I can go fishing, even if it's once a year or once a season, the reconnection and the recalibrating that happens in that time literally transforms the way that I look at the world. You go foraging one time, you're going to look differently at the produce section every time you walk into it. And it doesn't have to be all the time.
I believe it. And when you speak of it like that, it kind of, I get asked all the time, macros, how much protein, how much carbs, how much, how much fat. And when you speak of it like this, it kind of renders all of that unimportant, because when it comes to, let's say, macros, well, the macros you have is what is available at the time. So, and it changes throughout the year, and that's how humans did it, and that's how ancestors did it, and to just not worry about it, sort of thing. And it kind of takes all of that into a new context and a new perspective. So when it comes to just making plants eat better to digest, we obviously have big brains, and we realize that, okay, there are ways that we can take this produce and we can take these vegetables and we can make them last, for longer than they're going to last by fermentation, for example. So would you recommend like sauerkraut and kimchi and, basically pickling and fermenting every vegetable that you can basically? Would you recommend that?
So for all the things we're talking about, I think the first step, the first easy, accessible, empowering step that can lead to so many other things is fermentation, lacto-fermented vegetables. So things like sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, what have you. One thing to realize is, first off, it is an incredibly safe way to dip your toes into this world of making use of all the incredible wild microflora that's surrounding us to transform food into something that's safer, more delicious, more nourishing, changes the texture, changes the aroma. And that, if you're even considering in your mind, I want to learn a little bit more about cheese, cheese making maybe, or even things like salami or charcuterie, it is the same process that's founded on, in some cases, the same exact bacteria that's founded on making something like sauerkraut. So, and Sandor Katz, the guru of fermentation, and his book is one of the places I would start. Wild Fermentation is amazing. And one thing that he says is there's never been a reported case of anybody getting sick or going to the hospital from a fermented vegetable. And so this is a great, safe way to step your toes into this. And it can happen with a mason jar and a knife and a cutting board. There's some recipes in my book for it. There's a lot of information all over the place for it. Very
detailed, like lots of recipes, like how-tos. Yeah, it's very useful. Yeah.
And one thing to think about is, if you're and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are either already in this world or stepping into this world of, okay, cooking from scratch and maybe homesteading a little bit or that sort of thing. Canning and pickling are two completely different things. Pickling is actually fermentation. The term originally means fermentation, and fermentation or pickling means you take a vegetable or a suite of vegetables, put it in an anaerobic environment, usually with salt, and the wild bacteria ferment and transform it chemically and physically. One of the things that happens, many things happen, but one of the things that happens is that as the bacteria consume the starches, and it also produces lactic acid, which is a good thing, because as that pH drops, because it's becoming more acidic, it puts it into a very, very, very safe zone. So that more acidic environment is very safe. It's great for good stuff, and it's hostile to bad pathogens. Canning is skipping that step to do it. So one thing that you typically do with canning is you're adding vinegar. And when you add vinegar, you drop that pH into that safe range artificially, but you do that. And a lot of times you're also heating it to a very high temperature to kill off everything. But the problem with both of those things is the production of lactic acid through the fermentation process to make sauerkraut and kimchi is a chemical and physical process that transforms the vegetables into their safest and most nourishing forms possible. And in my mind, they're most delicious forms too, but there's a lot of things happening. Bypassing that with vinegar doesn't give you all those benefits, including not having all the wonderful, live microflora for your gut. Heating it up and canning it at that high temperature kills off bad stuff, but it doesn't discriminate. It kills off everything. So anything possible that was in there that would have been good beneficial bacteria or microorganisms is now dead too. You could maybe make the argument that as far as safety is concerned, the safest moment, as far as any bad bacteria at all or any bad pathogenic stuff, is as soon as you're done heating that jar to that really high temperature for that long period of time. But the dangerous thing is that is, from that second forward, it's the most susceptible to any problems. If something bad gets in, right, there's nothing fighting it. There's nothing. It's like a blank slate, a blank battlefield, and it has nobody fighting a battle for you. The great thing about fermented vegetables is that not only are they chemically and physically transformed into the most nourishing form possible, they're full of microorganisms, and those microorganisms are fighting a battle for you. So it helps keep it safe. So if you're in that world and you're already canning, think about fermenting. The final products look, and in many cases taste similar, but they're completely different foods. A lacto-fermented pickle and a pickle made through the canning process are completely different foods.
Right. As a nutritionist, I would usually recommend to people, have a tablespoon of sauerkraut a day. It's great for repopulating your gut. But now I'm thinking, okay, it's a much bigger story here. It should be a much bigger part of your diet because it's delicious, but then also it's the best way to consume vegetables. It's the best way to get the nutrients. So I have a question. Is there any safe way that you found to ferment nuts? Because, for example, you can have fermented cashews and you can make cashew cheesecake and all of these lovely things, cashew cheese as well. Does that process help with the toxins, or have you found with nuts it's not quite the same?
It'll help with a lot of the toxins. It will not help with the oxalates. So one of the dangers of doing that with certain nuts is you end up putting it into a state where you're eating massive amounts of nuts, like into a spread or into a cheese or whatever. But I will be honest, I haven't done the fermented nut cheese thing. We make a lot of cheese. We haven't done any from
you
nuts.
Probably never will, it's safe to say. Yeah, I think I get that from you.
The soaking of the nuts is incredibly important, right? So if you're, on the same token, if you're going to take and make, like, let's say you like peanut butter. Now, peanuts, even though they're a legume, they're still on they have oxalates, but they're not on the very high end. They're kind of in the middle. So peanut butter is something that we do have. We sell it here, we make it here, but I do have it in my diet some. Not a ton, but I do. But we take raw peanuts, we soak them overnight in water with a tiny bit of salt. And there is a little bit of fermentation that happens then, but it's more about the soaking process. And then we dehydrate them, and then we roast them, and then we make our peanut butter from that. That peanut butter is a different food than any peanut butter you're going to buy in the store. And it's something you can very easily make in your house. The peanut was first domesticated in South America, and anywhere that I went in South America, I did some actually potato research in Peru and Bolivia, but there were peanuts being consumed, and every peanut was soaked beforehand, just like oats. In Ireland, you go back even one generation, everybody soaked their oatmeal overnight before they consumed it. So they soaked it overnight, the next day they cooked it.
And it's so much more delicious that way as well. It's so much softer and it's lovely.
And you don't have to, you don't have to worry about this instant oats stuff. I mean, if you soak it overnight, it cooks as fast as instant oats do the next day. But again, it's a completely different food. So if you want to include these things in, and that's one of the things that we worked a lot, really, really hard on. I came from a perspective years ago where I was incredibly dogmatic and orthorexic about my views on diet. It mentally wasn't healthy, even though biologically it might have been incredibly healthy for me. And it was just this, never this, just this, never this. And it wasn't a sustainable way to live. And I don't think it was the most nourishing I've ever been. I think right now, the way that we approach food is the most nourished we've ever been, because I enjoy a whole range of foods. There are some things I never eat. There are some things I always eat. But the majority of things that are available to us, we consume, my family and I, and our community that comes in here, consume, but they do it in the healthiest way possible. We eat bread. We don't eat a lot of bread, but it's always sourdough. If we eat peanut butter, the nuts have been soaked. We do, if we do oats, the oats have been soaked. We do a granola here and we soak the oats in overnight in whey, and then we dehydrate it and put it in there. So there are ways of doing these and incorporating them into your diet. It isn't that you never can have them again, but it just makes sense take these steps. Not one of these things is going to make a difference in a week. It's that these small steps that you take day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, either create, if you do them, they create, nourishment, and if you don't do them, they create disease. And you don't have to do it overnight. So these things can be incremental, but a great place to start. And a lot of people listening right now, even if you've made it this far and you're still listening to the things that I'm saying, and you're like, okay, he isn't that crazy, but I have no idea what I should do. Then here's what you should do: pick the thing that you eat every single day or every single week. The most common thing that you eat, that's the thing that's either going to nourish you the most or have the biggest impact on you in a negative way, and learn how to make that as safe and absolutely nourishing as it can be. And if it's bread, if for me, our kids ate a sandwich every day at lunch, and that's a lot of sandwiches. That's a lot of slices of bread over the, however many years they've been in school. So one of the things we attacked first was, let's learn how to make, the best sourdough sandwich bread we could make. And that's what my kids have had the entirety of their time they were in school.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When you say pick the one thing that you eat the most and just work on that, that was my thought process as well. So in my household, it's bread, but then oats as well, because my son, I make it for him every morning, and I discovered the soaking, and now I just make the most delicious oats in the morning that have been soaked overnight. So I do want to come to that. I just have one question about nuts, and that is, so is peanut better than almond? So peanut butter better than almond butter?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yes. Okay. I think everyone just needs to know that, because
and that extends.
Everyone loves a bit of peanut butter, a bit of almond butter, so it's nice to know which is best. Yeah.
So if we're looking from an oxalate perspective, and if you haven't heard of the oxalate thing before,
I need to look into that
it
more. Yes.
If you have heard of it and you're sick of hearing about it, then change your filter, because you need to start hearing. You need to keep hearing about it. It is that important. But just on the oxalate thing, very quickly with almonds, because this is important. The oxalates come through in almonds. It comes through in almond flour. It comes through in almond butter, and it comes through in almond milk. And one of the issues right now with kids, and we're seeing more kids ever presenting with kidney stones, that are growing up in vegan households where they're drinking massive amounts of almond milk. Instead of cow's milk, they're drinking almond milk, and it's overloading their organs. So it comes through in all that. If you like that almond flavor, which I do,
yes,
it doesn't come through in almond extract. So almond extract doesn't have the oxalate. Extracts and oils don't have there's a lot of reasons not to have nut or seed oils, but oxalates are not one of them. They don't come through in the oils. They don't come through in the extracts. As far as nut butters are concerned, like I mentioned, nut and seed butters, almond butter is off the charts high in oxalates. is anything made from sesame. So tahini is
Right.
off the charts high.
Mm.
We do some peanut butter. It's not at the lowest spectrum, but it's kind of in the middle range. If you're not eating, half a cup of peanut butter every day, it's not that big of a deal. But we do make hummus here, and one of the things we had to figure out was what are we going to do if we're not using tahini.
Yes.
So one of the lowest oxalate containing seeds are sunflower seeds. So sunflower butter, if you're looking at it from an oxalate perspective, is fantastic and easy to make at home as well. But so we make our hummus with sunflower butter.
Okay, good to know. Noted. So let's go back to the sourdough, and because I know in your household, sourdough and your bakery as well, sourdough is a massive part of it. And it seems like from an outsider's perspective, it's almost like it looks like it's a passion for your family, like sourdough. And I have to say, just a quick personal story, I've been getting into making sourdough myself, and I'm absolutely loving the process. Like, I have my starter just up there, just kind of resting. You can't really see it. It's a little white bowl there.
I see it. Yeah, I see it.
So every day I'm kind of like, I use the Nourishing Traditions recipe, but I think I'll give yours a try as well. And I'm absolutely loving it, and it's, the family loves it. So when it comes to flour, are there any kind of particular types that you recommend? Because it was a big question that came up in my community, like which flour is the best flour to have. So would you recommend all flour? It's just a case of fermenting it first, soaking it first, or are there some you should just avoid altogether?
That's a really good question. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. To me, and the place that we're at this moment is we are competing as a father, as a business owner, we are competing with all the nasty food on the market from the industrialized food system that has literally people in lab coats tweaking flavors and textures and stabilize all these other emulsifiers, all these things in food that produce not only shelf life, but certain qualities that, our senses are tuned into, and we're fighting that. So in an ideal world, I would tell you should only use this flour to make this kind of bread. And if you're going to eat bread, that's the one bread you should be eating. But if our kids aren't going to eat it, then it doesn't make a difference, right? So also, if the flour that you're using is so hard to use, whether it's too sticky or you have to do certain things to just tweak that gluten, it's going to make a final product that maybe doesn't taste good, maybe doesn't look good. All those things factor into whether or not our kids are going to eat it. So the first thing I would say to somebody starting out making sourdough bread, use the most consistent bread flour that you can use to make the bread until you get your system and your skills up to a point where then you can start experimenting a little bit. Because I've talked to so many bakers that have tried to do this and this with this ancient grain over here and this ancient grain over here, and the results weren't good, they stopped making bread, or they make this bread that nobody would touch. So consistency, as you know, there's so many variables in making sourdough bread. I mean, you're dealing with trillions of bacteria, trillions of yeast, temperature fluctuations, humidity, grain, all these different things that if you can reduce the variables, it really helps. So we use here, and I started to learn a lot of our flour is King Arthur flour, which it was from the US. But one of the things, and it's good flour. But the thing I like about it is I can get flour in December and I can get flour in June that has the same qualities, same protein content, all of it. So the people that are working for us can really start to figure out, that's one variable they don't have to deal with. We do use bread flour as a base for most of our breads because of the gluten content that it needs to do things properly. If you want to start stepping in, so if you want to do sourdough that has no gluten at all, the easiest one I've figured to deal with that can create really amazing bread is rye. We do a lot of 100% rye. But if you are still in that sort of white bread wheat world and you want to start dipping into some more traditional or ancient grains, spelt is we do a lot of spelt in our flour in our breads as well.
Right. Okay. So something really interesting came up in my community because I did a podcast with Natasha Campbell-McBride, and she said that flour, sugar, and vegetable oil are the three legs that every disease stands on. And I got a lot of comments about that. And one of the comments was, well, in Italy, they, you know, they live on pasta and bread. Like, what are you talking about? So is there so you've been to Italy recently, so you can
A bunch, yeah.
you know Italy well. Um, what do you say about that? Like, do they have better processes over there with their flour? And do they live on pasta and bread as people think, you know? Like, what's the truth here? What's the
Well,
truth
first
about it?
off, I agree. I do agree with her, especially with the nut and seed oils and
Yes,
the sugar.
sugar. Yeah.
The flour is another one that, listen, and there's no human biological requirement to eat wheat at all. There's
Mm,
none,
mm,
and we'd probably all do better without it. But we do. So in an ideal world, if we're sitting in a little room and talking about the ideal human diet, biologically, wheat would never be a part of it. However, there are so many other things that go into making a meal nourishing, and part of it is the emotional and cultural pieces of it, and some of it is just the flavor profiles of things
mm.
or the texture of things. And some people just like, and I tell you, I hardly eat any bread at all, but I love a big, huge, thick, crusty piece of sourdough bread covered in butter.
Butter, yes.
Love it. I mean,
Yes.
I gain pleasure from
Yeah,
eating
it's
it.
brilliant.
And that's part of the whole thing. So if we're coming from that perspective that, okay, there's a lot of people that flour is just a part of their lives. What can we do to flour to make it a safe and nourishing spot? Sourdough is a part of it. Now, I will say in Italy, especially in certain places, sourdough, Sardinia is one. Sourdough is a real thing. Sicily, sourdough bread is still a real thing.
Yeah.
But so is a whole lot of pasta and things that aren't. Well, first off, any real pizzeria in Italy is fermenting. Now, some of them do sourdough, some of them do not, but they're all the good ones are fermenting their pizza dough for at least 2 days,
Wow.
sometimes three,
Yeah.
and so, sometimes even longer. But they are, and sometimes they're doing it with just yeast. But all of it is it's soaking, it's sitting. In an ideal world, it's got that bacteria too. It's full sourdough, but even we make our bread and our doughs. And Wonder Bread's made in an hour, literally an hour, start to finish.
Yeah.
And all these other, so the fact that it's sitting that long makes a big difference. And if anybody's had really good pizza in Italy, it's you sit down to a pizza pie that's about this big for each person, and you eat the entire thing. And if it's a good pizzeria, you get up and you're like, I'm good. Like, I'm good.
Yeah.
If you
It's very
eat that
different
much
from what we
pizza
get.
here, you're
Yeah.
like, oh my
Yeah.
God, my stomach. And I'm like, you're satiated, you're good, you're content. So there's that. They do eat. I still don't understand how they still get away with eating. I don't want to say they as they, but Italians
Yes.
in general eat as much pasta as they do. But it is a good example. Like I said, we were just in one of the blue zones, and we obviously talked about diet a lot there. One thing everybody there said was that they got it wrong. We eat massive, we eat a lot of animals. But they also kept saying it isn't just food. Food is a piece of it. And one thing they kept saying, first of all, they walk. We drove, it took us for the mountains in Sardinia were like this. The kids were literally ready to throw up when we got there. We were exhausted. We pull up. Literally this village is built into the side of a mountain. We get out of the car, big hugs to all the people I've been conversing with forever. And they're like, hey, let's take a walk. I'm like, I'm so tired. I just want to sit down. I just want to lay down. No, let's take a walk. And that's what they do. Like, they walk. The guy we stayed with, the family, his name is Marco. He's about my age, a little bit older. His father is 98 years old. His mother's 80. His father's 98. They walk up and down the roads to the mountain every day. Next door
Wow. That's
is a
incredible.
103-year-old man who lives in the house all by himself still, and he lives on the second floor, up and down
Amazing.
the steps every single day. So first off, they're
Amazing.
walking all the time, and they're talking. I mean, the one thing that they even said to us is, we're nice. Like, we're
Mm.
nice. Like, emotionally, culturally, we are just nice. Now, I'm sure there's stressors. I'm sure there's all kinds of things happening. If we lived there for 3 years, we'd start to figure all the players out and all that. But they're nice. They have a
Mm.
happy, they're smiling, they're happy. So all these, food is a piece of it, all these
Yes.
things together. If you go to Italy and try to go to do anything at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're going to be out of luck. All the stores are closed, not in the tourist trap areas, but Italy in general. Same thing in many other parts of Europe. Everything shuts down. 1 o'clock shuts down, doesn't open again until 5. Everybody goes home and visits with one another, or sleeps or relaxes. The lifestyle is different too. So yes, are they eating pasta? Yes. I don't know how they're getting away with it. They are. But I will tell you one other thing about one particular flour. If anybody's listening and makes pizza, from pizza dough from scratch, and we're using it here. There is a brand new flour, brand new. It's 5, 6, 7 years old, but Caputo makes most of the flour for almost all the pizzerias in Italy and most of the good pizzerias around the world. And they haven't changed what they've done in forever. They've been around since the late 1800s. But they several years ago, they came out with a brand new flour called Nuvola, Nuvola. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it a bunch of different places. And here's what they do with that flour. And we've had this conversation about, you and I, about sourdough long enough and soaking and things to understand why this is important. So most wheat farmers around the world, the wheat stalk grows, the wheat becomes mature, they let it dry. Around here, they spray it with Roundup to kill it first. But anyhow, they do that, and then they harvest this dried grain. They store it dried, they grind it, it stays dry, and then we make whatever out of it. Well, this particular flour, they let grow till it's mature, and then they keep it on the stalk for months. It gets hot, it gets cold, it gets wet, it gets dry, and several months later, they harvest those grains. And they've been through a natural soaking and fermentation process. And then we put it through a sourdough process, and they call it Nuvola, which means cloud, because it makes the most beautiful pizza dough.
Doubles up,
Doubles up, it's huge, but it is more nourishing for us as well.
Wow, that's brilliant. And I love the story about how, so it's not just about food, it's about lifestyle as well. And so I love how that kind of ties in with the Italians. Also, I'd add portion size as well, because I find that if they have pasta, yes, they have pasta, but it's very different from the portion sizes that you'd get from where we are. So they usually have like starter portion, like kind of small. But it's lifestyle that ties into it. So yes, they do have pasta and they do have pizza, but it's also the fact that they walk and that they're happy, and that's what you find in these blue zones, and that has a huge impact obviously on health. So so it's not just about food, it's about environment as well. So there was just something about when flour is soaked and fermented, does the gluten become safer to eat? So can someone who's gluten intolerant suddenly have some gluten and it's fine if it's prepared well?
So a couple things to understand: the gluten intolerance and even the celiac comes at different levels, right? So one thing, and this is all anecdotal, most of the people that come into our shop, and we have a full sourdough bakery here, that are gluten intolerant do absolutely fine on our breads.
That's incredible.
And this is the part that's controversial, but I'll tell you from experience, and I finally found, I think there's if you go back 5 years and ask me if anybody that was celiac could have sourdough bread, and I said yes, everybody would attack me. And it's absolutely not true. And all the scientific studies would have supported that. There have since been several, I believe it's 2 or 3 peer-reviewed studies that suggest that there are some people with diagnosed celiac that can be okay on a true, real sourdough bread. Now, it's not across the board, and I'm not even suggesting if you're celiac to have sourdough bread. I'm just saying that our thoughts on this are starting to change a little bit. Yes. But here's one of the problems, and I'm sure you recognize this as well. I don't know anywhere in the world where there is a regulation for what you have to achieve to call something sourdough. And I know for sure in the US it doesn't have to. And most of the foods from the grocery stores that say sourdough are actually not sourdough.
Yeah, definitely not.
Right. But people, especially since COVID, when sourdough becomes this big thing, people are like, oh, maybe there's something to the sourdough. And they go and try this sourdough. It says sourdough across the front. They try it and like, oh, I don't feel any different. And then the sourdough thing must not be true. There's only 2 ways to get real sourdough bread: either to make it yourself, which isn't that difficult to do, or to go to a place you actually trust, not to the Costco or the big box store where you don't know anybody there, a real bakery where they can tell you, yes, this is real sourdough bread. The fact that it says sourdough on the label doesn't mean a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just interesting. It's not that it means that having sourdough bread is good for gluten intolerance, but it's been found that it can be for some. So that's really interesting, and it shows that the quality of the food has a lot to do with gluten intolerance.
It does, and it also other added benefits. And again, I am not suggesting if you don't eat bread to start eating bread. There's no reason to start eating bread. If you're eating bread, and this is, I was on with Paul Saladino a few years ago, and he asked me that same question, and I knew he wasn't going to be very happy, but I think it was a good answer, and I wholeheartedly believe it. If you eat bread, if you're going to eat bread, this is the safest, most nourishing form of bread possible to have. And I think that's the way we should conceive. This isn't licensed to just go eat bread every day, because that's, if you're going to have bread, this is what you should have. This is the most, nutritious, safest way that it can be. In addition to transforming the gluten, first of all, it helps detoxify, right? We have lectins and all anti-nutrients, all these things on the outsides and on the grains themselves, that the problems with them get mitigated through the full sourdough process. And the gluten transforms into something that our body can handle, many of our bodies can handle a little bit better. And on top of it, it also changes the glycemic index. So if you're worried about your blood sugar, same exact ingredients, and there's been a lot of studies done here. If you just make a regular yeasted bread, the bread always, I don't care if it's 100% whole wheat grains, it always falls in the high range on the glycemic index. And same exact ingredients, putting it through the sourdough process drops it into the low range. I mean, it goes right through the middle range into the low range, which means that from a glycemic perspective, our body is dealing with that in a way very similar to just vegetables. Then there is, and I don't know much about this, we're just starting to look into it, but there's a lot of work being done now on resistant starch, kind of like when you boil a potato, then you cool it down and eat it, as opposed to just eating it hot.
Starch, yeah.
Exactly. Well, it turns out the same kind of thing can happen. It might be breads in general, but definitely with sourdough. So if you take, there's some suggestions that if you take and make a real sourdough bread and then freeze it, make it completely cool it, then freeze it and pull out slices of that to make your sandwiches or your toast from, the glycemic index is even lower.
That's really interesting. So anyone with blood sugar issues or gluten intolerance, like this is something to explore for sure.
Yeah.
And just one little thing about the sourdough, because I absolutely friggin' love it. I love making it. But something really interesting. So I was mixing the dough with a wooden spoon, and then I kind of rinsed the wooden spoon, and then I put it in the dishwasher and just kind of left it. And then so the next day I pulled out the dishwasher to kind of load a bit more, and the spoon was absolutely covered in fur, like just over one night.
Really?
Just one night, yeah. And that, you know how in a dishwasher, like the bowls and the cups, they're not growing fur overnight, like they just kind of look the same the next day. But just this one wooden spoon, it was just absolutely covered, and I was a bit icked out. I was like, oh, so I had to kind of get it out and kind of rinse it. But I was like, that is such a good sign, though. Like the fact that there's molds like thriving on that spoon is just like, it just shows that it's just brilliant. It's just full of life, and I absolutely love it. So for anybody listening who is listening to you and they're like, okay, so he makes loads of sense, but I'm so overwhelmed. Like, where do I even start? Well, I can't have salads anymore. But however people are perceiving this conversation, there is a way through it. So you say to start with the one thing or the couple of things that you have every day and just kind of work with that. Do you have any other tips for someone who is overwhelmed and doesn't know where to begin, or just doesn't have any time on their hands? Like, is there places they should buy it from, or better options in the supermarket? Like, do you have any tips about supermarket and what to buy? And like, just where can someone start if they want to start today, but they just don't have access or time to the best places?
The two first things I would suggest are, and this is a little more esoteric, but and I'll get into the details in a second. But number one is give yourself a break. Like, give yourself a break. Everything we just talked about, much of that has taken me 20, 25, 30 years to learn, and also how to implement into our diets at home. And into our restaurant downstairs. So give yourself a break. If you try to do all these, even if you were, had the desire to do all these things at one time, it's the infrastructure has to be in place, and that knowledge, skill set, knowledge base has to be in place, which is what you can build up over time. So have faith in knowing that if you decided to just start with some sauerkraut, you are taking a massively huge step in that direction, right? So if you just decide you're just going to maybe eat a little bit more local, or go to the farmer's market, or eat a little bit more seasonal, huge, massive step, that once that becomes comfortable, then it's easier to take another step and easier to take another step. So give yourself a huge break and be proud that you've taken any step whatsoever. The second thing is understand that almost every question that you're asking about food and nutrition is something that eventually you could answer yourself if you've connected with your food system on the level that I'm suggesting here. If you're wondering about the health benefit, or how much cheese you should have, or how much, or if this is this real cheese, or how much kidney or liver you should be eating. If you get to that point where you are connecting on that level and doing some butchering, or at least getting to know your butcher a little better, these are, you can envision when you're eating a steak, how much of that animal that steak represents, and what other pieces are you not in your diet, right? Even that, you can start to answer a lot of your own questions. If you start to think about things like limiting mechanisms we were talking about earlier, that handful of nuts, how much time would it have really taken to get that handful of nuts? Or if you're eating an apple in December, or you're eating a bunch of spinach in February, a new perspective on the environment, the world, your food supply, your place in all of it can help to answer all of these questions, or many of these questions. Then, practical things. Remove a link from your food chain. That's a huge one. And most of us, the only connection we have to people in our food supply is the person that brings us out at the cash register at the grocery store. So if taking a step and going to a farmer's market, talking to the farmer that grew that apple or raised that pig is a huge step. Going to a butcher, seeing it, going to an abattoir, all those sorts of things are huge steps. Buying a larger piece, if you eat animal product and meat, whatever, buying a larger piece of that animal is huge. And it doesn't have to be slapping an entire half a pig down on your countertop. It could be buying an entire chicken, or buying a shoulder of pork. Just think about this. If you went to the butcher and said, give me a pork shoulder, you can bring that home. What's in that shoulder itself, first of all, per pound, it's going to be cheaper than buying just a piece of whatever. But in that shoulder, you have fat, you have skin, you have bones, you have meat with different qualities. You can do everything from pulled pork to sausage to a roast, and pork rinds and bone broth, all from that one thing that came. And your kids, people in your house, actually see skin, they see a shoulder, they see something that resembles an animal, as opposed to just a package of ground up meat. That's a huge step, taking one step closer and closer to where the source of that animal was. As far as fruits and vegetables are concerned, it is worth looking at the vegetables you eat every day and seeing what people are saying about the toxic load on them and what you can do to make them safer. Fermentation is a huge detoxification, nourishing strategy for vegetables, but it isn't across the board. It doesn't do equal things to all that, but it's a great place to start. So start by making, maybe sauerkraut, getting the hang of that. But if there's another vegetable you're eating like a lot, like this is my go-to, every time I go to a restaurant, I order this, or I eat this 3 times a week, then it is worth taking a deep dive into that food. You're putting it in your body. Understand, maybe it's fine, or maybe it's something you shouldn't have, or maybe it's something you should treat a little bit differently. Think about spices are a great, not great. Different spices can also have different toxic levels in them, and some of it isn't a very big deal. Salt, I don't know any diet in the world that, any diet that I believe in that doesn't have salt at its core. Like salt is a great thing, put salt aside. But the other things, realize that the people don't get upset with me, I'm just telling you the truth. The spices, the things that make spices taste the way they do, are often the toxin that the plant is producing to keep things away. Like cinnamon, for example. Like cinnamon, that flavor of cinnamon is there in the bark of the tree to keep the insects away. And a little bit of it we enjoy, a lot of it would actually kill us and land us in the hospital. So pepper is another great example. The pungent part of black pepper is from an alkaloid called pepperine. It is incredibly bad. And plus black pepper is loaded with oxalates. In fact, we don't even use it in the restaurant any longer. Just as an example of kind of when you go down the rabbit hole and try to understand some of these things, and when you understand things like fermentation and maturity of plants and toxins in this, it all starts to make a lot of sense. Black pepper and white pepper are from the same exact plant. They're the same exact thing, except black pepper is an immature version of white pepper, and it has its skin on it still. So remember what I talked about, and it's a fruit, right? Yeah. So it's a fruit of the bush. So remember I said when a fruit is fully mature, it a lot of times lets down its defenses because it wants to get eaten, or it wants to attract. Black pepper is immature. and it still has its skin. It is loaded with pepperine. It is loaded with oxalates. White pepper is a mature version of that fruit, and it's been fermented, and it doesn't have its skin.
Gosh, so white pepper over black.
100%.
Love
100%.
this. Love this. Like, I feel like people can listen to this and just instantly start to make small switches. So that's another way to start, start using white pepper over black and peanut butter over almond butter. Like, it's just small little nuggets like that. It's just so
Yeah.
useful. And recently, as I've been learning more and more about how we should be eating, it's not about what you're eating, it's like how you should be eating. I'm finding supermarkets more and more kind of like, oh, like I kind of go around, I'm just like, oh God, like I just don't feel great when I walk around. I'm just like, I shouldn't really be getting my food from here. But I mean, in growing Cayman, we have farmers markets on a Wednesday, and they just sell fruit and vegetables. There's no like meat or anything done from here, so we get it imported from the US. So a lot of the food that we eat on this island is just imported from the US. So a lot of the time I'm just like, gosh, I just don't really have a choice, but I definitely get that feeling. And there's this quote by by Dr. Robert Lustig. He wrote Metabolical recently, and he did the books on sugar. One of his tips was, when you go into a supermarket, go around the edges, because if you go into the aisles, that's when you're off the rails, he says. And I just think that was really cool, and it's just really catchy. And yeah, there's some truth in that. So for anybody who needs to do supermarket shopping, it's just look into the ingredients that you're eating every day, do some research, and then start to shop a bit smarter. I guess that's the message. So just finally then, obviously you're on a mission, and you've been on a mission for a long time. So what are your hopes for the future regarding what you're doing, and how humans are going to eat in the future? What are your hopes?
That's a fantastic question. My number one hope, we're passionate about all of this. My entire family's involved with it. We have an incredible team downstairs. We have like 21 people now working at the kitchen. My number one mission is to reconnect people with their food, and by doing that, they reconnect with, I believe, themselves, their family, their community, their environment, and their ancestry, right? So all of these things, food is one of the best vehicles to do this. But as they reconnect with all of those things, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the questions that we have about food, diet, and health, and all of this start to become clearer, and they're not questions anymore. We start to answer these things ourselves. So that's our main mission. As a side note, kind of a byproduct of that, one of the things that we're incredibly passionate about as well is making sure that animals are treated as ethically as possible in life, in death, and also in the food system. And if we do that right, we're not only going to nourish ourselves better, but all of the aspects of the meat industry is going to be more ethical, it's going to be more sustainable, and it's going to be more economical for not only the consumers, but it's going to make sense for the small local farmers and abattoirs and butchers that are actually doing things right. And that's one of the reasons why we hold all sorts of classes here in person. We do things online. We're about to launch a home butchering video, excuse me, in the next couple of days. But that's one of the reasons why the heart of that is on animal, because I fully believe that the most nourishing aspect of our diets, not only in the past has been, and today should be, animal based, but I also believe we can do that in a much more ethical and sustainable way.
Wow. Well, I think you guys are definitely on track for that. You're making big waves, and I just wish you and your family all the best with what you do. But thank you so much for this conversation. So many truth bombs, and so much truth. I can feel it in myself. I'm just like, God, there's truth in this, what we're talking about. And I hope that everybody can gain something from this conversation, which I'm sure they can. So what is the best way for people to kind of get involved with what you're doing?
All right, awesome. So there's a couple ways to be involved and to have access to the information and or the food that we create. So my family and I, we have a nonprofit called the Eastern Shore Food Lab. So all of our research, and we're continuing to do research. That's why we're just in Sardinia recently. All of our research, our education, our outreach is funneled through our nonprofit, the Eastern Shore Food Lab. And you can find information out about that on Instagram at ES Food Lab, and my Instagram at Dr. Bill Schindler, Dr. Bill Schindler. And our website is eatlikeahuman.com. And then downstairs, everything that we learn and everything that we preach and everything that we share, we translate that into actual real food production. So we have a restaurant downstairs called the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, and you can find out information about that at Modern Stone Age Kitchen and www.modernstoneagekitchen.com. And we have it's a full service restaurant downstairs, and we also, a lot of our products we also ship. And we just to sort of put it in a nutshell, we don't use any industrial nut and seed oils. We do all in-house nose to tail butchering. We make everything 100% from scratch. There's no two ingredients put together outside of our walls. We make our butter, we make our cheese, we ferment our vegetables, we make pepperoni, all of it. All of our grains are sourdough, all of our maize is nixtamalized, and we don't use any industrial, not only industrial nut and seed oils, but we don't use any refined sugars either. So if you're in the area, we're on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. We're only, even though we live in a rural, beautiful little rural area, we're only about an hour from DC, an hour and a half from Philly, and about 2.5 hours from New York City.
Lovely. Oh gosh, if I'm ever on that side of the world,
let me know.
I'd have to, yeah, I'd have to pay a visit because it sounds unreal. But thank you so much. This is a fab conversation, and hopefully we get to do it again.
Awesome. Anytime. Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you.